My family abandoned me and my 3-year-old in a foreign country as a joke. Next time they saw us, if you've ever been betrayed by people you thought you could trust, you'll understand the gut-deep sting of realizing that family doesn't always mean loyalty. I learned this lesson the hard way, on what was supposed to be a dream vacation. When my own relatives abandoned me and my 3-year-old daughter in a foreign country on purpose, just to humiliate me. The whole nightmare started with a trip that was sold to me as a family bonding experience. My parents, my older brother, and his wife had planned a 2-week holiday overseas. They had talked for months about sightseeing, eating exotic food, and creating memories together. At first, I hesitated to join because money was tight and traveling with a toddler wasn't easy. But my mother insisted it was important. She even offered to cover part of the cost, saying it would be good for my daughter to spend time with her grandparents. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I thought maybe this was a chance to reconnect, especially since things had always been tense between me and the rest of the family. I was the youngest, the one they teased for being too sensitive, the one they joked had ruined her life by becoming a single mom. But I still clung to the hope that maybe, deep down, they loved me and wanted me around. The first few days of the trip were exhausting but manageable. My daughter was wide-eyed with wonder at the new sights, while I juggled snacks, strollers, and constant bathroom breaks. My parents barely helped, often walking ahead while I scrambled behind with my little girl. My brother and his wife treated me like I was the family maid, always expecting me to watch their luggage while they went off exploring, or to keep my daughter quiet so she wouldn't ruin the vibe. Still, I kept swallowing my frustration, telling myself that this was how families were. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe if I just endured, things would improve. But then came the day that changed everything. We had been in the city for about a week when my father announced a surprise day trip. He was grinning, my brother was snickering, and even my mother looked amused. They told me to pack light and wear something comfortable. I didn't question it. I just got my daughter ready, slathered sunscreen on her tiny arms, and hoped the day would finally bring some joy. The destination was a bustling outdoor market near the harbor, packed with tourists, vendors, and street performers. At first it was overwhelming but fun. My daughter squealed at the colorful balloons, and I tried to relax into the moment. My family walked ahead, weaving through the crowds, laughing amongst themselves while I kept a tight grip on my little one's hand. Then, without warning, they vanished. At first, I thought I'd simply lost sight of them. I pushed through the sea of people, scanning faces, calling out for my parents and brother, but there was no sign of them. Minutes stretched into an hour. Panic clawed at my chest as my daughter clung to me, her eyes wide with fear. Finally, I got a message on my phone. It was from my brother. 3 simple words: "Good luck, sis." I froze, my stomach dropping. Another ping followed a photo of my family sitting at a seaside cafe, drinks in hand, smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Maybe this will teach you responsibility." That was when it hit me. They hadn't lost me. They had abandoned me, on purpose. The reality of the situation sank in quickly. I was in a foreign country with limited cash, no local knowledge, and a 3-year-old who needed food, water, and safety. My so-called family had decided to teach me a lesson by stranding me miles from the hotel. It wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. I should have broken down then and there. But something inside me snapped instead. The years of being belittled, mocked, and treated as the family burden boiled over into a cold determination. If they thought leaving me stranded would break me, they were wrong. I wasn't just going to survive this, I was going to remember it, and one day, they would regret underestimating me. I found a quiet corner, calmed my daughter with a snack, and started asking for directions in broken phrases. It took hours, but I managed to find a bus that took us back toward the city center. From there, I stumbled through a mix of gestures, translation apps, and sheer desperation until we finally made it to the hotel. When I walked into the lobby, exhausted, sweaty, and holding my sleeping daughter, my family was sitting there laughing. My father raised an eyebrow, my brother smirked, and my mother muttered something about how I was too dramatic. They called it a joke. They said it was funny, that I needed to lighten up. They acted as if nearly traumatizing a toddler was nothing more than a prank. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. One didn't cry. I just nodded, carried my daughter upstairs, and shut the door behind me. That night, as I watched her breathe peacefully in her sleep, I promised myself something. this trip would not end the way they thought. They believed they had humiliated me, that I would crawl home defeated, but I was already planning, already envisioning the day when they would look at me with the same shock and regret that I had felt standing alone in that marketplace, and that day was coming, sooner than they thought. When most people talk about betrayal, they focus on the sting of the moment, the sharp cut that comes from realizing someone you trust has turned against you. But what they don't talk about is what comes after, the long silence, the quiet calculation, the way your mind replays every detail, not in grief, but in growing determination. That's where I found myself after my so-called family's joke. We had several days left on the trip, and I endured them with a calm mask, carefully hiding the storm inside me. Outwardly, I seemed quiet, even subdued. I let my parents and brother believe I had taken their cruel stunt to heart. They probably thought they had taught me a lesson, that I had learned to stay in line, to be the obedient daughter and the shameful little sister who didn't make waves. But inside, I wasn't broken. I was sharpening. Every time they laughed at me, every time my brother made a snide remark about my life choices, every time my mother rolled her eyes at the way I parented my daughter, it only added fuel to the fire burning in my chest. My father, always the ringleader, strutted like he was untouchable. He thought his authority was absolute, that I would never have the strength to defy him. They had no idea what was coming. By the time we returned home, the tension between us had grown so thick it could be cut with a knife. I didn't bother confronting them directly. What was the point? They thrived on making me the punchline, on twisting my pain into entertainment. Words would never change them, but actions could. I threw myself into work. Every late night, every early morning, every sacrifice was a stepping stone toward independence. While they still viewed me as the struggling single mother barely keeping her head above water, I was quietly building something stronger. I secured a better job, one that allowed me to work remotely at times. I started taking online courses, expanding my skills, and I poured love and stability into my daughter, determined that she would never feel as small and unwanted as my family had made me feel. What they didn't realize was that being abandoned had stripped away the last illusion I had about them. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer cared to fit into their twisted definition of family. All I cared about was preparing myself for the day when I could turn the tables. The opportunity arrived faster than I expected. A few months later, my brother announced he was getting married. The family was ecstatic, buzzing with excitement, throwing around plans for a lavish wedding that would showcase their wealth and status. My father boasted about it to anyone who would listen. My mother became obsessed with every tiny detail, and my brother basked in the glow of being the golden child. And me, I was barely considered. When the invitations were sent, mine arrived late, shoved into an envelope with none of the flourish given to others. It was clear they didn't really want me there, but they couldn't risk the gossip of leaving me out entirely. They probably imagined I would show up quietly, sit at the back, and provide them with one more opportunity to sneer at how far beneath them I supposedly was. What they didn't know was that the wedding would become the stage for my revenge. The months leading up to the ceremony were a blur of hushed whispers and secret preparation. I had no intention of playing the part of the quiet, forgotten sister anymore. If they wanted to humiliate me publicly, then I would return the favor in a way they could never forget. I started making connections through work, through people I had met online, through sheer persistence. I discovered that my brother's pristine reputation wasn't nearly as untouchable as he pretended. There were cracks in the facade, secrets carefully tucked away that he hoped no one would ever uncover. And as I gathered information, I realized that the wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was leverage. But it wasn't only about him. It was about all of them. My parents, who had mocked me for years. My brother, who had left me stranded with a toddler in a foreign country. My mother, who always excused their cruelty as just jokes. They thought they were above consequences. I was determined to show them how wrong they were. The night before the wedding, I lay awake in my small apartment, my daughter breathing softly beside me. I studied her tiny hand curled around her blanket, her innocent face untouched by the cruelty of the world. For her sake, I needed to be strong. For her sake, I needed to show that no matter how much they had tried to break me, I was unshakable. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity. It was about sending a message so clear that even they couldn't twist it into another joke. I wasn't the timid girl they had abandoned in that marketplace. I wasn't the scapegoat, the failure, the family embarrassment. I was their reckoning. The day of the wedding dawned bright and golden, as if mocking the storm that brewed inside me. My parents fussed over every detail. My brother strutted in his tuxedo, and my mother fluttered like a queen bee among the guests. I arrived quietly, dressed simply but elegantly, my daughter's tiny hand in mine. They barely acknowledged me. My father gave me a nod of thin tolerance. My mother muttered something about being surprised I even made it, and my brother didn't bother with more than a smirk. But I didn't flinch. I didn't falter. I just smiled, knowing that before the night was over, everything would change, because revenge isn't loud. It doesn't scream or demand attention. Revenge waits. It grows in silence, nurtured by every insult, every slight, every betrayal, and when it finally arrives, it doesn't need to announce itself. It simply strikes. And as I watched my family celebrate, oblivious to what was coming, I knew one thing for certain. By the time this wedding was over, they would never look at me the same way again. Weddings are supposed to be moments of joy, unity, and celebration. But as I stood at the edges of my brother's grand event, I didn't see family warmth. I saw a carefully constructed theater, every flower arrangement and champagne flute placed to disguise the ugliness that lived beneath the surface. The venue was extravagant, an ornate ballroom with golden chandeliers spilling light across polished floors. Guests mingled in designer suits and glittering gowns, sipping wine while whispering about how perfect the couple looked. My parents floated among them, shaking hands, boasting about their son, and parading their status like royalty greeting their subjects. And then there was me. They seated me near the back, as though I were an afterthought. I recognized the insult immediately. The tables closest to the bride and groom were reserved for important family members, while my daughter and I were tucked into a corner with distant relatives and acquaintances who barely knew our names. I felt the sting of their dismissal, but it was drowned out by the steady pulse of my resolve. They had no idea that the seat they thought was humiliating would give me the perfect vantage point to watch everything unfold. As the ceremony began, I watched my brother stand tall, basking in the admiration of the crowd. His bride, beautiful and glowing, floated down the aisle like a vision. To anyone else, it looked flawless. But I couldn't help noticing the shadows under the surface, the way my brother's smile stretched a little too wide, the way his eyes darted nervously as though keeping track of something hidden. I knew those cracks because I had found them. In the months leading up to the wedding, I had done my research. I learned things my family never thought I had the resourcefulness to uncover. I learned that my brother wasn't the faithful, loyal fiancé he pretended to be. That while his bride-to-be poured her heart into planning this perfect day, he had been sneaking around with someone else, and not just anyone. It was a coworker, someone who knew about the wedding but didn't care, someone who had saved the evidence in texts, photos, and late-night receipts. When I first discovered it, I wrestled with the weight of the information. Exposing him would destroy not just the wedding, but the image my family had worked so hard to project. And then I thought about that day in the foreign marketplace, the fear in my daughter's eyes, the sound of my family's laughter as I stumbled back to them. That memory hardened me. If they wanted to see me as worthless, then I would show them how powerful I could be. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and applause. My father beamed like he had orchestrated the entire universe. My mother dabbed at fake tears, and my brother accepted the adoration like it was his birthright. I clapped politely, blending in, my daughter perched on my lap. To anyone watching, I looked harmless, but inside, I was readying my strike. The reception was when everything truly began. The ballroom transformed into a celebration of glasses filled with expensive champagne, a towering cake that looked more like art than food. Music swelling as the newlyweds took to the dance floor. Guests cheered, laughter echoed, and my family preened in the center of it all. And then came the toasts. This was the moment I had been waiting for. One by one, voices rose to honor my brother and his bride. Friends told stories of loyalty and love. My father gave a booming speech about family values, and my mother gushed about raising the perfect son. Each word dripped with hypocrisy, each boast twisting like a knife in my chest. Finally, it was my turn. The microphone was passed to me, almost as an afterthought. My father's eyes narrowed as if daring me to embarrass him. My mother looked uneasy, clearly hoping I would decline. But I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked to the front with a calmness that made even me marvel. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need theatrics. My voice was steady, deliberate, as I began recounting memories of my brother, not the shining, polished version my parents adored, but the darker truths that lay beneath. I spoke of loyalty, yes, but not his loyalty to his bride. I spoke of choices, but not the ones that honored his vows. And then, with the quiet precision of a blade sliding between ribs, I revealed the affair. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't scream. I simply presented the truth, backed by undeniable proof. I held up printed messages, receipts, and even photos that left no room for denial. The room fell silent, gasps rippling like waves, faces turning pale. The bride's expression crumbled as she stared at her new husband, who sat frozen in shock on my. Father tried to interrupt, his booming voice cutting across the silence, but it was too late. The words were out, the evidence undeniable, the carefully constructed facade shattered beyond repair. My mother's face drained of color. My brother stumbled to his feet, but no amount of protest could stitch together the wreckage. I didn't gloat. I didn't linger. I simply placed the microphone down, gathered my daughter into my arms, and walked back to my table. All around me, the chaos erupted. The bride fled the room in tears, her family close behind. Guests whispered frantically, some leaving immediately, others staying to feast on the spectacle. My brother chased after his bride, but his protests rang hollow against the proof I had laid bare. My parents, red-faced and trembling, tried to contain the damage, but the humiliation was irreversible. For the first time in my life, the laughter wasn't aimed at me. It was at them. As I sat back down, my daughter pressed her head against my shoulder, too young to understand the storm but comforted by my steady presence. I whispered a silent promise to her. We would never again be the family's punchline, because revenge, when it finally arrives, doesn't just wound, it transforms. And that night, in the glittering ruin of my brother's wedding, I knew the transformation had only just begun. The hours after the wedding became a blur of whispers, accusations, and fractured illusions. What had started as the grandest event my family had ever hosted had ended in scandal, so devastating it would be talked about for years. Guests abandoned the reception early, their eyes darting with curiosity and glee, eager to spread the story of how the perfect family's son had been exposed at his own wedding. I didn't stay to watch the rest. Once my words had landed, I knew the damage was permanent. The rest was noise, screaming, sobbing, pleading, but nothing could erase what I had done. With my daughter's hand in mine, I left before the final curtain fell. When we returned to the quiet of my apartment that night, the silence felt like victory. For once, I didn't feel the weight of shame pressing on me. Instead, I felt a lightness, as though years of humiliation had been peeled away. But revenge has a way of not staying silent for long. The following week confirmed it. My phone buzzed constantly, not with congratulations, but with venom. My mother's voice left messages, dripping with fury. She called me a traitor, accused me of destroying my brother's life, of humiliating the family in front of important people. My father's words were sharper still, laced with threats and disdain. He reminded me I was nothing without their name, their support, their approval. But that was the irony. I had already survived without them. What stung wasn't their anger, it was their arrogance. They couldn't see that my brother's downfall was his own doing. They couldn't accept that my revelation had been truth, not betrayal. To them, appearances were everything. And I had shattered the mirror they loved so much. I let their words wash over me without reply. For years, I had craved their acknowledgement, bent myself into knots trying to prove I was worthy of their love. But now, their fury was proof I had struck them where it hurt most. Then came the retaliation. But my father was not a man who took humiliation lightly. He had built his life on control of his business, his reputation, his family. Losing that grip, even for a moment, was intolerable. And I knew it was only a matter of time before he turned his full attention on me. It started small. Rumors circulated in the community, whispers about me being bitter, unstable, desperate for attention. People who once smiled politely now avoided my gaze in the grocery store. I recognized my father's handiwork in the sudden shift of perception. He was trying to rewrite the story, to paint me as the villain who ruined an innocent man's wedding. But I didn't panic. I documented everything: screenshots, messages, encounters. I had learned my lesson long ago. The only way to survive my family was to stay prepared. Then, one morning, the attack escalated. A letter arrived, formal and cold, stamped with legal insignia. My father was suing me. The accusations were as absurd as they were cruel defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, even claims that I had fabricated evidence to ruin my brother's marriage. I laughed when I first read it, though the sound was hollow. The man who had mocked me for years, who had left me stranded in a foreign marketplace with my daughter, was now trying to drag me into court for daring to speak the truth. And yet, the weight of the lawsuit pressed on me. Court wasn't cheap. Lawyers weren't forgiving. I didn't have the wealth or resources my parents commanded. I had my job, my small apartment, and the savings I guarded carefully for my daughter's future. My father thought he had found the perfect way to crush me. He believed the pressure would make me fold, that the fear of financial ruin would silence me where shame never had. He was wrong. I prepared. Night after night, after my daughter was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. I built timelines, organized evidence, highlighted inconsistencies. I contacted the woman my brother had cheated with, and though she was reluctant at first, she eventually agreed to provide her own proof if needed. Every detail mattered. Every scrap of truth was a weapon, and I was determined not to walk into that courtroom defenseless. Still, I couldn't ignore the exhaustion. There were moments, late at night, when I stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was worth it. Was revenge worth being dragged through mud, worth sacrificing peace for? But then I remembered the look in my father's eyes at the wedding, the mocking disdain that had fueled years of hurt, and I remembered my daughter, who deserved a mother unbroken by cruelty. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. The court date loomed closer, each day ticking like a drumbeat in the back of my mind. My family, once so loud and present, had gone silent. They were regrouping, strategizing. I could almost picture them in my parents' living room, plotting my downfall as if I were an enemy to be crushed. In their world, love had always been conditional, loyalty transactional. To them, my resistance was nothing short of betrayal, but I wasn't afraid, not anymore. On the morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my jacket. My daughter stayed with a trusted friend, blissfully unaware of the battle her mother was about to fight. I looked at myself, not the quiet, overlooked girl my parents had once dismissed, but a woman forged by fire, sharpened by betrayal. When I walked into the courtroom, my father was already there, flanked by expensive lawyers in tailored suits. He didn't look at me at first, as though acknowledging me would be beneath him, but when his eyes finally did meet mine, I saw something flicker behind the anger. It wasn't triumph, it was unease. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. For the first time, my father didn't know how the story would end. The gavel struck, and the proceedings began. The stage was set, not for a wedding this time, but for war. And I was ready, because this wasn't just a battle for my dignity anymore, was the battle for my daughter's future, for the truth, for every wound my family had ever inflicted. As I sat there, my hands steady on the table, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My father had underestimated me. The courtroom was about to show him exactly what that mistake would cost. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy, thick with tension that clung to my skin. Rows of wooden benches lined the space, each filled with onlookers eager for spectacle. My family sat clustered together, a united front as always, with my father at the center. His expensive suit was flawless, his posture commanding, but I saw the faint tremor in his jaw as he glanced at me. The judge's gavel struck, and the case began. My father's lawyers wasted no time in painting me as the villain. They described me as vindictive, unstable, and obsessed with tearing down the family name. They pointed to the wedding, calling my actions cruel, calculated, and unnecessary. Their words were sharp, rehearsed, dripping with the kind of authority that only money could buy. To the casual observer, their argument was convincing. They had resources, confidence, and the full weight of my family's influence behind them. My father sat back, his lips curled in satisfaction, certain that his plan was unfolding perfectly. But what he didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, feeling the eyes of the courtroom bore into me. I wasn't dressed in designer clothes or flanked by high-powered attorneys. I had one lawyer, a kind, steady man who had agreed to represent me for a fraction of what my father was spending. The contrast between us was almost laughable, but I had something they didn't. I had the truth. Piece by piece, I laid out the evidence. I presented the photos, the text messages, the emails, I detailed the timeline of my brother's infidelity, connecting every dot until the pattern was undeniable. My voice was steady, my hands calm, though inside, my heart pounded with the force of years of repressed fury. The courtroom murmured as each revelation landed. My father's smugness began to falter, the corners of his mouth tightening. He had expected me to crumble, not to rise, but I wasn't finished. The pivotal moment came when I revealed the weapon I had kept hidden until now, the call logs. For months leading up to the wedding, my father had spoken directly with the woman my brother had cheated with, not to scold her, not to protect his son's fiancée, but to silence her. He had threatened her, paid her off, and ensured that the family image remained untarnished. I watched the color drain from his face as the evidence was read aloud. The courtroom erupted in whispers, the air electric with disbelief. My father, the man who prided himself on his honor and control, was exposed as the architect of deceit. This wasn't just about a brother's betrayal anymore. This was about a father who had manipulated everyone, who had protected a lie at the expense of truth. And then came the final blow, the secret I had whispered to no one until that day. Years ago, in one of his more careless moments, my father had confided something to my brother, believing it would never reach me. It was a detail about his own past, buried deep and hidden away. A call sign from his days in service. A call sign tied to an operation that had gone terribly wrong, one he had worked hard to erase from memory and record. He thought no one remembered it, but I did. I had stumbled across it while working in translation years earlier, when I was tasked with reviewing declassified military documents. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but the details stuck with me, and when I heard him use it drunkenly one night, bragging to my brother, I made the connection. Now, in the courtroom, with all eyes on us, I spoke the words clearly, deliberately, letting them hang in the air like a blade. The effect was immediate. My father's face blanched, his composure cracking in a way I had never seen before. His lawyers froze, unsure how to proceed. The judge's eyebrows lifted, intrigued. To the public, the call sign might have seemed insignificant, but to those who understood, it was damning. It tied him to actions that contradicted the very image he had built his life upon. For the first time, the power shifted entirely. He wasn't in control. I was. The rest of the proceedings blurred after that. His lawyers scrambled, objected, attempted to downplay what had been revealed, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and no amount of wealth or intimidation could stuff it back into silence. But by the time the session ended, the judge had dismissed most of their claims as baseless, noting the overwhelming evidence in my favor. My father's lawsuit, designed to destroy me, now lay in ruins at his feet. I walked out of that courtroom with my head high, my daughter's small hand clasped in mine. The whispers followed Usaba, the scandal, the betrayal, the secret that had stunned everyone, but I didn't care. For the first time, I wasn't the forgotten daughter, the easy target. I was the one who had stood against them and won. But revenge is rarely a clean cut. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. My brother's marriage collapsed, completely, the bride leaving him once she learned how deep the lies ran. My father's reputation took a hit so severe, it couldn't be polished away. Former allies distanced themselves, business partners grew hesitant, and the family name, once a symbol of power, became synonymous with scandal. At home, the silence from my family was deafening. No more calls, no more threats, no more venom. They had gone quiet, not out of peace, but out of defeat. My father, the man who had tried to crush me, was nursing wounds that no courtroom victory could heal. And though I should have felt nothing but triumph, there were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had gone too far. Revenge, after all, comes with a cost. I hadn't just exposed them, I had dismantled them, and even if they deserved it, even if they had abandoned me and my daughter in ways no family ever should, the wreckage still lingered in my mind. But then I would hear my daughter's soft breathing beside me, feel her small fingers curl around mine, and remember why I had done it. This wasn't just for me. It was for her, because in the end, the choice had never really been about revenge. It had been about survival, about showing her that we were not powerless, no matter how others tried to make us feel, about proving that truth could stand against wealth, lies, and cruelty. And as I tucked her in one quiet evening, I realized something else. The war wasn't truly over. My family might have retreated for now, but people like my father didn't forget. They regrouped, rebuilt, plotted in silence, which meant I had to be ready. The courtroom had been my battlefield, but the final reckoning, the moment when my father would face everything he had done, was still to come, and I was more prepared than ever to deliver it. The storm that followed the courtroom battle should have been enough to end it all. My father's humiliation had been public, his credibility shredded, his image forever altered, but deep down, I knew him too well to believe he would stay defeated. My father was not a man who accepted loss gracefully. He was a strategist, a manipulator, a commander who had lived his entire life believing control was his birthright. And for weeks after the trial, I felt the weight of his silent presence pressing against my life. He hadn't reached out, not directly. No threats, no calls, no accusations. But absence can be as heavy as action. I could sense the plotting, the coiling of anger behind closed doors. He was regrouping, and I had to prepare myself for whatever would come next. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. This time, I would finish what I had started. It began with whispers in the community, rumors of lost files, of people digging into old records, of military associates suddenly contacted for favors. My father was trying to clean up the damage, to bury the call sign, and erase the connection before it spread further. He had money, influence, and connections that still obeyed him out of loyalty or fear. But what he didn't realize was that I had already moved first, before the trial. Before I had spoken the call sign aloud, I had made copies, not just of the evidence against my brother, but of everything that tied my father to that forgotten operation. Files, recordings, documents that I had secured carefully, quietly, waiting for the day they would be needed. And that day had come. I wasn't reckless with it. I didn't release it all at once, though the temptation clawed at me. Instead, I allowed it to trickle, out-controlled, measured, impossible to trace back to me. A journalist here, a leak there, a carefully timed email to the right investigative committee. Enough to keep the questions alive, enough to prevent him from ever fully covering his tracks. The walls he had built around himself for decades began to crack at the same time. I focused on rebuilding my own life with a determination that surprised even me. I poured myself into my work, carving out stability for me and my daughter. I took on extra projects, found a small but warm apartment, and surrounded myself with people who cared about us not out of obligation, but out of genuine connection. For the first time, I was living outside the shadow of my family's power. For the first time, my daughter was growing up in a home where love wasn't conditional, where laughter could exist without fear of judgment. But even in those moments of peace, I knew the reckoning hadn't truly arrived yet. My father had been weakened, humiliated, but not destroyed. The man who had tried to crush me would not simply fade into silence. And sure enough, the call came. It wasn't a phone call or a letter. It was a summons, a formal invitation to a family gathering, cloaked as an opportunity to reconcile. My father was hosting a dinner, one meant to reassert control, to draw me back into his orbit under the guise of peace. Many would have refused. Many would have protected themselves and stayed far away. But I knew this was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the battlefield where the final blow would land, so I accepted. The night of the dinner, I dressed simply, but with intention. No designer labels, no borrowed elegance, just myself, steady and unshaken. My daughter stayed with a trusted friend. I would not bring her into that den of manipulation. The family estate looked the same as always. Pristine gardens, towering gates, a house so polished it seemed untouchable. But beneath the surface, the rot was visible now. The staff's gazes lingered too long, their whispers sharper. The aura of control my father had maintained for decades was slipping, and everyone could feel it. Inside, the table was laid with perfection: crystal glasses, silver cutlery, food arranged with military precision. My family sat in their usual positions, faces cold, eyes calculating. My brother avoided my gaze, his shame still fresh. My mother's hands trembled as she tried to smile, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. And at the head of the table, my father. His expression was carefully composed, but I saw the storm beneath it. He raised his glass, began to speak of family, of unity, of moving forward. The same empty words he had used my entire life. The same manipulation disguised as authority. This time, I didn't flinch. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the polished floor. I lifted my own glass, but instead of agreeing to his charade, I spoke. Not with rage, not with venom, but with clarity. I reminded the room of what had been hidden, of the lies told, of the lives damaged by his choices. I reminded them of the cost of silence, of complicity, of bowing to power at the expense of truth. And then, for the final time, I spoke the call sign aloud. Clear, sharp, undeniable. The reaction was immediate. Gasps around the table. My brother's eyes widened. My mother's glass slipped from her fingers. And my father, my unshakable, untouchable father, went rigid. His mask shattered in an instant, the fury and fear spilling across his face for all to see. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His hand shook as he gripped his wine glass, his knuckles white. For the first time in my life, I saw him powerless, truly powerless. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his shallow, strained breaths. And in that silence, the truth was undeniable. The empire he had built, the control he had wielded, the authority he had demanded, was gone. Not because I had screamed, not because I had fought with fists or fury, but because I had revealed who he truly was. That night was the end. Not just of the battle, but of the war. In the weeks that followed, my father withdrew from public life completely. His influence dwindled, his allies scattered, his legacy crumbled piece by piece. The man who had once seemed larger than life was reduced to whispers and shadows, and I, Amelia, the daughter they abandoned, the mother they mocked, was free, not because I had destroyed him, but because I had survived him, because I had stood in the face of everything he tried to take from me, and I had chosen to fight back now, years later, as I sit with my daughter, older, stronger, filled with her own laughter and light. I realized that revenge was never really the point. Survival was, truth was, teaching her that no one, not even family, has the right to diminish your worth. My family abandoned me once, thinking it was a joke, but when they saw me again, when they heard the truth, when they felt the weight of what I carried, they learned the hardest lesson of all, that the one they underestimated was the one who would bring them to their knees, and that lesson is one they will never forget.